Imagine a CEO, a single dad, walking into a blind date, expecting nothing more than a nice dinner. But what if that night, just before the new year, he found not just a connection, but his future fiancée? You won't believe how this high-powered executive's life took a completely unexpected turn, leading him straight to love when he least expected it. David Carter's penthouse looked like a place built for applause, not for living. The walls were glass, the furniture was sharp-edged and expensive, and the city below glittered like it was trying to impress him back. On most nights, David liked it that way. Clean, predictable, quiet enough to think. But tonight, the quiet didn't feel like peace. It felt like space where thoughts got too loud. New Year's Eve had a way of doing that, turning every reflection into a verdict. Outside, Karachi-level cold wasn't the issue, it was the calendar. The year was ending whether David was ready or not, and for the first time in a long time, he couldn't distract himself with a late call or a last-minute deal. His phone still buzzed, of course, because being a CEO meant someone, somewhere, was always trying to pull him back into the machine. But he'd muted most of it, and the silence that followed made him uneasy. A man who negotiated contracts like chess moves shouldn't be pacing in front of a mirror as if he were about to sit an exam. But that's exactly what he was doing, tugging at the cuff of a shirt and second-guessing a tie like his entire life depended on the choice. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd walked into boardrooms filled with people eager to see him fail and felt nothing but clarity. Yet the idea of a blind date had him acting like a teenager. It wasn't even the date itself that rattled him. It was what the date represented. A door he'd kept locked, a part of life he'd told himself he didn't have time for, a risk he'd convinced himself he couldn't afford because his one real priority was asleep in the next building. Noah was 6, the kind of 6-year-old who carried big thoughts in a small body. He had David's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and he asked questions that were impossible to answer without exposing the truth behind David's careful composure. David had learned that children didn't care about polished explanations. They cared about whether you were there. He'd built his entire world around being there, not just physically, but emotionally too, even when he didn't know how. After Noah's mother left, David didn't tell himself a dramatic story about betrayal or bitterness. He told himself a practical story, the kind a CEO would tell. Some people can't handle pressure. Some people leave. Some people aren't built for the life they chose. He filed it away like a disappointing quarterly report and moved on. Except it wasn't a report. It was a child watching the front door for a person who didn't come back. And that had rewired David's life. He stopped going out unless he had to. He stopped letting people in. He stopped believing in someday because someday had a habit of turning into never. He learned how to make dinosaur-shaped pancakes. He learned the difference between a fever that could be managed at home and one that required a panicked drive at 3 in the morning. He learned that Noah could sense stress in a room the way smoke senses fire, and that a single heavy sigh from David could make Noah's small shoulders tense like he was preparing for impact. So David trained himself to be steady. The world could be chaotic, but David Carter would be the stable point in Noah's universe. That promise wasn't negotiable. Which is why the blind date felt so complicated. It wasn't about David wanting romance, it was about other people wanting it for him, as if companionship was a checkbox he'd missed on some life checklist. And the primary culprit behind this entire operation was his sister Claire. Claire had a gift for bulldozing through David's defenses with a smile and a tone that implied she was doing him a favor by not physically dragging him to happiness. For weeks, she'd been dropping hints like breadcrumbs. You need to meet someone. No one needs to see you laugh. You're not a robot even if your calendar says you are. David had countered with logic. He had responsibility. He had limited time. He had no interest in bringing someone new into Noah's life. Claire had rolled her eyes and said, "You're not marrying her tomorrow, David. It's dinner." He'd said the same thing back. "It's dinner. Why does it have to be a blind date?" Claire had answered with that infuriating confidence she had when she believed she was right. "Because you won't do it otherwise." He'd tried to argue that he simply didn't want it, but even he had heard how hollow that sounded. Wanting was not the same as allowing. He wanted quiet, too, and yet the quiet was starting to feel like a cage. Claire knew it. Families always did. They watched you fall into patterns you called survival and named them what they really were: fear. David checked his watch again. Too early. Still early. He'd planned to arrive 10 minutes ahead because he planned everything, and the idea of arriving late made him itch. He walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water he didn't drink, and stared at the view as if the sightline might offer a strategy. His phone lit up with a message from Claire. Don't bail, it's one dinner. Be human for 2 hours. David stared at the screen, tempted to reply with something sarcastic, but his mind was already rehearsing escape routes. If the date was awkward, he could claim an urgent call. If she seemed interested in his money, he could politely end it. If she mentioned wanting a father figure for future kids, he could run. He wasn't proud of how quickly his mind searched for red flags. It's just what he did now. After you'd been left once, you started treating intimacy like a risk assessment. A soft knock interrupted him, gentle but familiar. David opened the door to the hallway and saw Mrs. Hanif, the older woman who lived across from the nanny's apartment where Noah was staying for the night. She wasn't really a neighbor so much as a second grandmother, the kind who offered unsolicited advice and food and somehow made it feel like comfort instead of intrusion. "He's asleep," she said before David could ask, as if she could read his thoughts. "And he insisted I tell you something." David's chest tightened. "What did he insist?" Mrs. Hanif smiled. "He said, tell Dad he has to come back before the fireworks end because Captain Fox gets scared of loud noises." David breathed out, a small laugh escaping beside him. Captain Fox was Noah's worn plush toy, missing one button eye, stitched up in 2 places, and treated like a military commander. "I'll be back," David said, more to himself than her. Mrs. Hanif studied him with that older person precision that made you feel transparent. "You are allowed to have a life too," she said quietly. "Children do not benefit from parents who disappear into duty." David nodded, even though part of him bristled at the suggestion that he was disappearing. He wasn't disappearing, he was protecting. But protection, he was learning, could become another kind of absence. After she left, David walked into Noah's room to see him one more time. The nanny had tucked Noah in neatly, but Noah had kicked one leg free, as if even in sleep he refused full containment. His cheeks were warm, his lashes dark against his skin, Captain Fox tucked under his arm like a secret. David sat on the edge of the bed, careful not to wake him, and brushed a hand over Noah's hair. The sight made something in him ache, the same ache he felt every time he realized Noah was growing and time was moving, and David couldn't freeze life no matter how tightly he controlled his schedule. He leaned down and whispered, "I'm right here." Noah didn't wake, but his fingers curled slightly around Captain Fox, and David took that as proof that children felt more than they understood. He stood, pulled the blanket up, and paused at the door, watching his son breathe as if he could memorize the moment. Then he forced himself to leave because he couldn't build Noah a future by staying stuck in fear. Back in his penthouse, David grabbed his coat, his keys, and his phone and stood at the door longer than necessary. It was ridiculous, he told himself. It was dinner, a meal with a stranger, nothing more. Yet his heart thudded like it was anticipating impact. He opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and locked it behind him with a final click that sounded too symbolic. In the elevator, he stared at his reflection in the mirrored wall, noticing the tightness around his eyes, the way his jaw held tension even when he wasn't speaking. He looked like the man the world expected, polished, controlled, unshakable. But he didn't feel unshakable. He felt like a man walking towards something he'd avoided for years, not because he didn't want it, but because he was terrified of what it could cost. As the elevator descended, the city lights rose into view through the lobby windows, and David told himself one more time that he could turn around, he could cancel, he could claim an emergency, he could retreat into the safe life he'd built. Instead, he walked out into the night, into the cold air and the noise, and the sense of possibility hanging over New Year's Eve like a dare. And he got into his car with one thought repeating louder than the others: don't let fear be the reason you stay alone. David reached the restaurant 20 minutes early, which was exactly the kind of thing he pretended was normal and everyone else quietly found intense. The building was dressed for New Year's Eve in that tasteful way that still screamed money, with soft gold lights, frosted wreaths, and a piano near the bar playing something slow enough to feel romantic, but not slow enough to feel like a dare. He gave his name at the host stand, kept his shoulders relaxed, and smiled the way he did at charity dinners when cameras hovered nearby. The practiced expression that said confident, calm, in control. Inside, though, his mind was doing what it always did when he couldn't quantify the outcome, scanning for variables, trying to predict how this would go wrong, bargaining with himself about how long he had to stay before it counted as trying. The host led him past tables packed with couples already leaning into midnight, groups in glittering outfits laughing too loudly, and a handful of lonely people pretending they were just here for good food. David told himself he was here for good food too, that this was nothing. Then he saw her at the corner table near the window, and nothing immediately became something. She wasn't fussing with her hair or checking her phone every 5 seconds. She sat with her hands around a warm mug, watching the snow drift outside like it was a gentle show meant just for her. And when she looked up, her eyes met his with a steadiness that made David's careful defenses feel suddenly thin. She stood as he approached, smiling in a way that wasn't polished or strategic. And for a half second, David forgot the lines he'd rehearsed, because the room seemed to narrow down to the space between them. "David?" she asked, voice calm and warm, like she wasn't testing him. "Yes," he said, and then he heard Noah's sleepy voice from earlier in his head, the casual certainty of a child, and the name came out of him before he could stop it. "Maya?" The smile on her face shifted, surprised and amused, and for a beat, David wondered if he'd just committed the most awkward mistake possible, misnaming the one person he was supposed to impress. But then Maya's eyebrows lifted with recognition, and she repeated softly, "Your son?" David's stomach tightened in a protective reflex. "He said your name," David admitted, suddenly aware of how exposed that sounded. "He told me to say Happy New Year to Miss Maya." Maya's expression softened, not into pity, but into something gentler, almost relieved, like a puzzle piece had clicked into place. "Noah's a sweet kid," she said, and David's heartbeat jumped at how naturally she said his son's name, as if Noah wasn't a footnote to her, but a person she actually knew. The host pulled out David's chair, and David sat slowly, trying to decide whether he should end the night right now. Every instinct he had screamed that his son was not a topic for strangers, that Noah's world was sacred, that David had spent years keeping it controlled and safe. Yet the woman across from him didn't look like a stranger who wanted access. She looked like someone who understood why a single father would be on edge, and that understanding made David pause. "How do you know him?" David asked, keeping his tone neutral even though the question was sharp at its edges. Maya didn't flinch. "I volunteer with a small program connected to his school," she explained. "It's not therapy exactly, more like guided activities for kids who've been through changes, big changes. They talk, they draw, they learn little ways to calm their minds when they feel overwhelmed." David's chest tightened again, this time with guilt, because he hadn't known Noah was part of anything like that. He hasn't said he's struggling," David said, and he hated how defensive it sounded, as if he was being accused of failing. Maya's voice stayed gentle. "Kids don't always announce it," she said. "Sometimes they just carry it quietly. Noah's bright and he's brave, but he's also observant. He notices things adults think they're hiding." David heard Mrs. Hanif's words from earlier about disappearing into duty and felt heat rise in his face. "What does he say?" David asked before he could stop himself. Maya smiled, careful. "I don't share personal things he tells me," she said, and the boundary in her tone eased something in David. "But I can tell you this, he adores you. He talks about you like you're the safest thing in his world." David swallowed, throat suddenly tight, because he wasn't used to being described in terms of safety. The waiter arrived, asked if they wanted sparkling water or something stronger, and David almost laughed at the absurdity of choosing between bubbles and whiskey while his entire inner life quietly rearranged itself. Maya ordered sparkling water. David matched her, partly because it felt respectful, and partly because he needed a clear head. They looked at menus, but the food was suddenly irrelevant, and David found himself studying Maya's hands, noticing there was no flashy jewelry, no performative luxury, just neat nails and a simple ring on one finger that looked sentimental rather than expensive. "Claire didn't tell me you knew Noah," David said, testing the name, letting it sit between them. Maya's lips curved. "She didn't tell me you were a CEO," she replied, and the way she said that made David's shoulders loosen. No awe, no hunger, just a mild curiosity like he'd shown up wearing a costume he didn't need. "She just said you were a single dad who works too much and refuses help," Maya continued, and David exhaled through his nose because that was painfully accurate. "She said you wouldn't come unless it was framed as one dinner, and you'd probably sit like you were about to negotiate a merger." David glanced down at his posture and realized he absolutely was. "Do I really look like that?" he asked. Maya smiled wider. "A little," she said, and then added, "But your eyes give you away. You look tired in the way people look when they've been strong for too long." That line landed harder than it should have, because David had spent years making sure no one noticed the tired. He attempted to pivot, asking about her work, her background, anything that didn't involve his ribs cracking open in public. Maya told him she worked with community outreach during the day and volunteered at the children's center in the evenings, not because she was trying to be a saint, but because she'd once needed someone like that when she was younger. She didn't give a dramatic backstory, just enough to make David understand her compassion wasn't theoretical. When she asked about his job, she didn't say, "Wow," or "That must be amazing." She asked, "Do you like who you have to be to do it?" And David nearly choked on his water because no one asked CEOs questions like that. He answered honestly anyway, surprising himself. "I like what it provides for Noah. I don't always like what it turns me into." Maya nodded as if that made sense, and suddenly the conversation wasn't a performance. It was two people being real in a room full of glitter. Then the small, unexpected moment happened, the kind that would have felt like a minor inconvenience on any other night, but became something intimate because Maya was there. A little boy, maybe 5, wandered past their table looking panicked, eyes shiny, cheeks flushed, clearly separated from whoever brought him. He hovered near the entrance as the host stand grew busy, and his face crumpled like he was about to cry. Without thinking, David slid out of his chair and crouched to the child's height, his voice shifting into the tone he used with Noah. Calm, steady, not too loud. "Hey, buddy," David said. "You look like you're searching for someone." The boy nodded, swallowing hard. "My mom," he whispered. I went to the bathroom and I can't find her." Maya was beside David in a second, not crowding the child, just offering her presence like a soft blanket. "You did a smart thing by stopping here," she told the boy. "Can you tell me what your mom is wearing?" The child described a sparkly scarf, and David stood, kept one hand lightly on the child's shoulder, and signaled to the host stand, who immediately looked around. Within moments, a woman rushed from the hallway, breathless with fear, scooping the boy into her arms and thanking them repeatedly, voice trembling. David nodded, reassuring her it was fine, but Maya gently said, "He handled it really well," and the boy's face lifted with pride. When the mother walked away, David returned to the table, and Maya looked at David with something new in her eyes, something that felt like respect, not for his title, but for his instinct to be a dad. "You're a good dad," she said quietly. David sat back, a little stunned by how much that mattered to hear from someone who actually worked with kids, someone who didn't flatter people for sport. He tried to shrug it off, but his voice softened. "I'm trying," he admitted. Maya held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary, and David felt that same tight pull in his chest, the one that wasn't anxiety anymore, but possibility. Outside, the city lights reflected in the snow like scattered confetti, and inside, the music shifted to something brighter, the room subtly leaning toward midnight, and David realized he wasn't looking for an escape route now. He was wondering what it would feel like to stay, not just for dinner, but for whatever came after. As the restaurant filled up with that special New Year's Eve energy, the kind that made strangers laugh like friends and made every clink of a glass sound like a promise, David and Maya somehow stayed in their own pocket of calm, like the noise couldn't quite reach their table. The waiter returned to take their order, and David realized he hadn't even decided what he wanted, because for once his attention wasn't split between a menu and a mental list of tomorrow's problems. Maya noticed his hesitation and leaned in slightly, scanning the options with him as if it were the simplest thing in the world to share a decision. "You look like you're about to ask the chef for quarterly projections," she teased, and David surprised himself by laughing, a real laugh that loosened something in his chest. "I can't help it," he said. And then, because honesty was suddenly easier with her, he added, "I'm out of practice with anything that isn't work or parenting." Maya's eyes softened. "That's not a flaw," she said. "That's a season." The words were gentle, but they landed heavy, because David had been calling it a permanent state. Their food arrived, and for a few minutes they ate and talked about lighter things, the harmless kind of conversation that usually filled first dates, travel memories, favorite movies, the ongoing debate about whether pineapple belonged on pizza. Except even their lightness had depth, because Maya didn't perform humor to impress him. She used it the way people use warmth when they've learned life can be cold. David found himself telling her small stories he didn't normally share, like Noah's insistence that every superhero needed a feelings coach, and how Noah had once tried to write a contract for bedtime that included one extra story and no scary dreams. Maya laughed so hard she covered her mouth, and David watched her with a strange ache because he couldn't remember the last time he'd made someone laugh like that without trying. At some point, Maya asked, "What's the hardest part for you?" And David almost gave the polished answer, the one he could say without feeling anything. Time management, responsibility, balance. But her gaze held him steady, and he heard himself answering the truth instead. The quiet, he said. When Noah's asleep and the apartment is too still and I realize I'm the only adult in his world, it's not the work that scares me, it's messing him up. Maya didn't rush to reassure him with cliches. She nodded like she understood what it meant to carry someone else's childhood in your hands. You're already doing something right, she said. Bad parents don't sit awake worrying about whether they're bad. David swallowed, and the tension in his throat made him take a sip of water just to buy himself a second. He didn't want to get emotional in a restaurant, especially on a first date, especially on New Year's Eve, but he also didn't want to go back to pretending. He's everything, David admitted, and sometimes I feel like I'm failing him by by not giving him more than just me. Maya's voice stayed steady. Kids don't need perfect, she said. They need consistent. They need someone who shows up even when they're tired. And Noah talks about you like you're a guarantee. David's brow furrowed. He talks about me? Maya caught herself and lifted her hands slightly, careful. Only in the way kids talk, she said. Nothing private, just, he trusts you. He believes you when you say you'll be there. That's rare. The word rare hit David harder than he expected because it made him realize how much he'd built his life around being a promise that didn't break. He set his fork down, and for a moment they just looked at each other, the kind of quiet that usually feels awkward on a first date, but somehow felt natural here, like the silence had its own language. Then Maya reached into her bag slowly, not dramatic, and pulled out something small, a folded paper dinosaur, neatly made, with tiny drawn-on eyes that made it look cheerful. She placed it on the table between them like it was an offering. One of the kids taught me how to make these, she said, and then very carefully, Noah likes dinosaurs, right? David stared at it, caught off guard by how specific and thoughtful it was. His protective instincts flared again, but not as suspicion, more like caution in the face of something tender. He does, David said. Maya nodded. I didn't bring it for him, she clarified quickly, sensing the direction his mind could go. I brought it because Claire told me you might mention him, and it helps me to have something in my hands when I'm nervous. She smiled a little, almost embarrassed. But when you told me he knows my name, I thought, maybe, if you're comfortable, you could give it to him. Or you could throw it away after tonight if you want. I just didn't want to pretend he wasn't part of your life, because he is. The way she asked for consent, the way she offered an exit without guilt, did something David didn't expect. It made him trust her more. I won't throw it away, David said quietly. He'll love it. Maya's shoulders relaxed, and David realized she'd been holding her breath under her calm. He picked up the paper dinosaur and turned it in his fingers, strangely moved by how such a small thing could carry so much respect. Claire really didn't tell me I'm a CEO, he asked, still testing it. Maya snorted in a surprisingly unfiltered sound. She told me you ran a company, she said, but she also told me you don't know how to rest and you think solving problems is the same thing as connecting with people. She said you'd show up dressed like you were about to meet the president. And David glanced down at his suit. Is she wrong? He said. Maya's eyes danced. Not even a little, she replied. And David laughed again, softer this time, because being seen like that didn't feel like being attacked. It felt like being known. They talked about why they'd both agreed to the date, and that's where the chemistry deepened into something more serious. Maya admitted she'd almost canceled, not because she didn't want to meet someone, but because she'd been burned by people who treated her kindness like a service. I don't want to be someone's good influence or their peace, she said. I want to be a person. I want partnership. David nodded slowly because that was exactly what he wanted too, even if he hadn't let himself say it out loud. I don't do casual, he confessed, and the admission felt like stepping into cold water. I don't even know how to. It's either nothing or everything. And after Noah's mom, he stopped, jaw tightening, because the sentence held a scar. Maya didn't push. She waited, giving him space to choose his honesty. David exhaled. After she left, I promised myself I wouldn't bring anyone close enough to leave again. Not because I think everyone leaves, because I can't let Noah watch it happen twice. Maya's gaze didn't waver. That's not you being cold, she said. That's you being a father. Her voice softened. But David, protecting someone doesn't always mean keeping everyone out. Sometimes it means choosing carefully who gets to come in. The words made David's chest tighten because they were dangerously reasonable, and he was a man who had been living as if fear was logic.
The restaurant lights dimmed slightly as more people arrived, and the staff began placing champagne bottles on tables in anticipation of midnight. Around them, couples leaned closer, friends took selfies, and a group near the bar practiced an early countdown like they couldn't wait for permission to start over. David looked at Maya and felt a kind of pull he couldn't quantify, not just attraction, though it was there, but something steadier, alignment. "Can I ask you something?" David asked. Maya nodded. "If this becomes real," he continued, careful with every word, "what does real look like to you with a kid involved?" Maya didn't answer quickly, and David respected her for that. When she spoke, her voice was clear. "Real means slow," she said. "Real means Noah's comfort comes first. It means you don't rush a child into calling someone family. It means I earn trust and I don't demand it." She paused, then added, "And it means I don't date you in a way that ignores the fact that you're a dad. I don't want a version of you that exists only when Noah's asleep." David's throat tightened again, but this time it wasn't guilt. It was relief, the rare kind, the kind that comes when someone says the exact thing your heart has been waiting for. He nodded, holding the paper dinosaur like it was suddenly precious. "That," he said, voice rough, "sounds like the first plan that made sense to me in years." Maya smiled, and the moment hung there, warm and electric, not because they touched, because they didn't need to. It was the kind of chemistry that lived in the way two people listened, the way they didn't flinch from the hard parts, the way the future didn't feel like a trap. David glanced towards the window where the snow was falling thicker now and realized midnight was creeping closer. For the first time since he walked in, he wasn't thinking about leaving early. He wasn't thinking about an excuse. He was thinking about what it would feel like to step into the new year with someone who didn't want his title, didn't fear his silence, and didn't treat his son like an inconvenience. And that thought, more than the champagne, made him feel dizzy with possibility.
By the time dessert plates were cleared and the restaurant lights softened into that late-night glow, David could feel the whole room subtly leaning toward midnight, like everyone's bodies were already counting down, even if their mouths weren't yet. The staff moved faster, glasses appeared on tables without anyone asking, and the piano near the bar switched to brighter songs that made people smile at strangers. But at David and Maya's table, the energy felt different, quieter and heavier in a good way, because something real had settled between them, and neither of them was trying to brush it off as just a nice date. David kept turning the little paper dinosaur in his fingers, feeling how carefully it had been folded, how the tiny eyes made it look oddly brave, and he kept thinking of Noah's sleepy voice earlier, the casual way his son had said "Miss Maya," like she was already a known part of his world. He wasn't sure whether that made him feel comforted or exposed, but he knew it mattered. Maya checked her phone once, not to scroll, just to glance at the time, and when she looked up, her expression was soft but slightly tense, like she was trying to keep her emotions from running ahead of the moment. "It's almost midnight," she said, and David nodded, surprised by how quickly the night had moved, because he'd arrived expecting to monitor every minute, and now he was wishing time would slow down. "Do you want to stay here for the countdown?" he asked, already knowing his own answer and still asking anyway, as if giving her full control of what happened next might be his first act of trust. Maya looked around at the packed room, the rising volume, the crowded bar, and then back at him. "Could we step outside for a bit?" she asked. "Not because I don't like it here, I just want to breathe." David stood immediately, grateful for the excuse, and they made their way out through the warm lobby to the cold street, where the air hit David's face like a reset button. Outside, the city was alive with movement, cars inching forward, people bundled up and laughing, fireworks already popping in the distance like impatient punctuation marks. Maya pulled her coat tighter, and David instinctively moved closer, not touching her yet, just closing the space so she wouldn't feel alone in the crowd. And it surprised him how natural that felt, like his body recognized a role his mind had been denying. They walked without a plan at first, passing a small park where a group of teenagers practiced a loud countdown that ended in dramatic cheers and the kind of laughter that made David nostalgic for a version of himself he barely remembered. "Do you have a New Year's tradition?" Maya asked, hands tucked into her pockets, breath visible in the cold. David almost said no, because the truth was his tradition had become work, sleep, repeat. But honesty came easier with her. "I usually put Noah to bed and answer emails until the year changes," he admitted. "It's not exactly festive." Maya smiled, but it wasn't mocking. "That's not a tradition," she said gently. "That's endurance." David felt that word hit because it was accurate, and because he'd been proud of endurance like it was a personality. "What about you?" he asked. Maya hesitated, then said, I write a note to myself, just a few lines, something I want to remember when life gets loud. She paused, then added, Last year it said, stop settling for half love. David glanced at her, the side of her face lit by a street lamp, and he realized she wasn't telling him this to be dramatic. She was telling him because she trusted him with her truth, and that trust made him want to rise to the moment instead of hiding behind jokes. Did it work? He asked quietly. It did, Maya said. It cost me, but it worked. They reached a small overlook near the river where the skyline opened up, and a handful of people had gathered there with cups of tea and phone cameras pointed toward the buildings. David checked the time and felt a pinch of responsibility. He'd promised Noah he'd be back before the fireworks ended, and in his mind, the promise mattered more than anything else. He stepped a little aside and called Mrs. Hanif, keeping his voice low, and when she answered, she told him Noah was still asleep, Captain Fox secured, no signs of the plush commander panicking. David thanked her, hung up, and turned back to Maya, feeling the odd mix of relief and urgency that comes when you realize you have permission to be present, but only for a while. Everything okay? Maya asked. David nodded. Dad check, he said. He's sleeping. Maya's face softened again, and she didn't say anything that sounded like advice, which made David like her more. Instead, she just said, good, like Noah's peace mattered to her too, not as leverage, but as reality. The countdown energy started building around them. More fireworks cracked in the distance. People began clustering tighter, and someone near them started chanting 10 minutes, as if announcing a train arrival. David felt his phone buzz, and when he looked, it was a text from Claire. If you come home alone, I'm telling Noah you're scared of romance. David snorted, and Maya leaned in, reading how his expression changed. Your sister? She guessed, and David nodded. She's going to be unbearable about this forever. Maya laughed, the sound bright in the cold, and then it faded into a quieter smile as she looked back at the skyline. Can I be honest? She asked. David's heart thumped once, heavy. Please, he said, because he meant it. I didn't expect this, Maya admitted. I thought it would be a nice dinner with a tired single dad and we'd wish each other well. But I feel, she searched for the word, and David watched her like the rest of the crowd didn't exist. I feel like something important is happening, she finished, almost embarrassed. David swallowed, because he felt it too, and he didn't like how much it scared him. Me too, he said, and then added, because the truth was already up on his tongue. And that's the problem. Maya turned to him fully. Why is that a problem? She asked, not defensive, just curious. David stared at her for a second, trying to decide whether to keep protecting the version of himself that never risked anything. And then he chose differently. Because if this matters, then it matters to Noah, he said, voice slow and rough. You're not wrong to be careful, she said, but you're also not being fair to yourself if you decide the ending before the beginning. Her words were calm, but they hit like a challenge. David looked around at the crowd around them, at couples hugging and friends shouting and strangers cheering, and he realized he'd spent years treating love like a luxury item he couldn't justify, while the rest of the world treated it like oxygen. The countdown began somewhere behind them, a loud group starting early, and the numbers rippled outward as other people joined in, their voices layering until the whole overlook became a chorus. 10. David took a breath. 9. He suddenly remembered the first time Noah had fallen asleep on his chest after a nightmare, the way David had promised him out loud that he would always be there. 8. He remembered how lonely that promise felt when he realized it meant David might never let anyone close again. 7. Maya's eyes stayed on him, steady, like she could handle his fear without trying to fix it. 6. David reached into his coat pocket, not because he'd planned a proposal like a movie scene, but earlier that day, in a moment he told himself was ridiculous, he'd picked up a simple silver band from a jeweler near the office. A clean silver band, nothing flashy, something that looked like a promise instead of a purchase. And he'd shoved it into his pocket as a private joke to himself, like, see, you can pretend you're open to this even if you're not. 5. He felt the ring in his palm now, and his pulse kicked, because suddenly the joke wasn't funny. 4. David stepped closer to Maya, close enough that she could feel his breath. I don't do impulsive, he said quickly, almost apologizing. But I also don't want to start another year hiding behind caution. 3. Maya's eyes widened, her hand lifting slightly like she didn't want to interrupt what was happening but needed to be ready in case he was going to run. 2. David opened his hand and showed her the ring, and his voice went softer. This is going to sound insane, but I've spent years making choices that look responsible and feel empty. Tonight didn't feel empty. It felt like coming back into my own life. 1. Fireworks exploded across the skyline, light pouring over the city, and the crowd roared, but David barely heard them.
"Be my fiancé," he said, not as a performance, not to impress anyone, because the words felt true in his chest. Not because it's midnight, not because it's romantic, because I want to choose you on purpose, and I want to do it in a way that respects Noah and respects you. Slow, steady, real. Maya's breath caught, and for a heartbeat he thought he'd misread everything, that he just scared the best thing that had happened to him in years. Then Maya smiled through sudden tears, the kind that come when something hits a place you didn't know was still tender. "Yes," she whispered, and then she reached up and touched his face lightly, grounding him. "But only if we do it the right way," she added, voice shaking just a little. "No rushing Noah, no pretending this will be easy. Just honesty." David nodded hard, relief flooding him so fast he almost laughed. And when he kissed her, it was not for the fireworks or the crowd. It was quiet and close, and full of that strange feeling of stepping into a new life without a map. Around them, people cheered and hugged and shouted Happy New Year, and David, for the first time in a long time, believed it.
Morning always had a way of stripping romance down to reality, and David felt that truth the moment he opened his eyes. The city outside his windows looked calmer than it had the night before, as if it had already used up all its glitter and gone back to being honest. And for a few seconds, David lay still, half expecting to feel regret crash down on him like a hangover. He'd proposed to a woman he'd met hours ago, on New Year's Eve, in public, with fireworks overhead. It was the kind of thing he would have rolled his eyes at if it happened to someone else. Yet instead of regret, what settled in his chest was a strange, steady warmth, like his body had finally unclenched after years of bracing. He turned his head and saw Maya asleep beside him, hair spread over the pillow, one hand resting near the simple ring now on her finger. And the sight didn't make him panic. It made him feel protective in a way that wasn't possessive, more like awe that she was here at all. David sat up carefully so he wouldn't wake her, ran a hand down his face, and tried to remember when he'd last felt this calm in the morning. Usually he woke up already tense, already moving, brain racing through schedules and risk assessments. Today, there was still risk, but it felt different because he'd chosen it, and choice was the one thing he'd been denying himself. He slipped out of bed, pulled on a sweater, and went to the kitchen, where the emptiness of his penthouse suddenly looked more obvious. The place was built for efficiency, not warmth. He poured coffee, and as the machine hissed, his phone lit up on the counter like a warning flare. Messages, notifications, missed calls. David stared at the screen and felt his stomach drop as he realized what he'd ignored in the rush of midnight. Claire, the menace he loved, had absolutely taken photos, and Claire was the type to treat private moment as family content. He unlocked his phone and saw it immediately, a picture of him and Maya under fireworks, her hands on his face, his lips on hers, and the ring visible if you zoomed in. Claire had posted it with the caption, "Told you he could be human. Happy New Year." The post was already moving. Likes, comments, shares. Someone had screenshotted it. Someone had tagged a gossip account. The internet did what it always did. It found a story and began rewriting it for entertainment. David's pulse jumped hard, the calm evaporating like steam. He was used to headlines, but those headlines were about mergers and market rumors, not his son's future, not Maya's face, not his private life. He scrolled through the early comments and already saw the edges of what was coming. Speculation about whether this was a publicity move, people congratulating him as if they knew him, others warning Maya to get that bag, and one particularly cruel comment about how women always chase rich single dads. David's jaw tightened. He could handle criticism aimed at him, but he could not tolerate strangers turning Maya into an assumption, or worse, turning Noah into a plot point. He started typing a message to Claire that was 90% rage and 10% panic, then deleted it because he didn't want the first conversation of the year with his sister to be nuclear. Instead, he called her, and she answered breathless with excitement, as if she'd been waiting for his reaction. "Happy New Year," Claire chirped. "Delete it," David said immediately. The cheerfulness on the other end paused. "Oh, come on," she protested. "People are happy for you." David lowered his voice, forcing calm. "I'm not worried about me," he said. "I'm worried about Noah and Maya. This is going to turn into noise. You didn't ask." Claire sighed, the sound of someone realizing she'd crossed a line even if she believed her intentions were good. "Okay," she said quietly. "You're right. I got carried away. I'll take it down." David closed his eyes, relief mixing with irritation. "Thank you," he said. And then, because he couldn't help it, he added, "Also, you're grounded." Claire laughed softly. "Fine," she said, "but I'm still taking credit." She hung up before he could respond, which was classic Claire. David watched the post disappear a minute later, but he knew deletion didn't erase the internet. The image was already out, the story was already moving. The only thing he could control now was how he handled it, and David's instinct was to lock everything down, to go into crisis mode, to protect by retreating. He was standing there with his coffee cooling when he felt Maya behind him, her presence warm against the cold spike of his anxiety. "Hey," she said softly, voice still sleep-heavy. "You're awake early." David turned, and the moment he saw her face, the urge to hide his stress flickered, but he remembered what he'd promised: honesty. "It's already online," he said, holding up his phone. Maya blinked, then stepped closer and looked at the screen without flinching. She didn't gasp, she didn't accuse him. She just took a slow breath. "Your sister posted," she gasped. David nodded. "It's taken down," he said quickly. "But," Maya nodded, understanding the unspoken. "But it's out there. But people will talk. But my world is messy." David waited for her to pull back, to regret her yes, to say this was too much. Instead, Maya set the phone down and looked at him with that steady calm that made him feel both exposed and safe. "This is part of your life," she said. "I'm not naive about that." Then she added, "But I want to be clear. I didn't say yes because you're a CEO. I said yes because of the way you talked about your son and the way you looked at me like I mattered. I can handle noise. I just can't handle secrecy." David exhaled, some of the tension releasing. "I don't want to hide you," he said. "I want to protect you." Maya's smile was small but real. "Protecting me doesn't mean controlling the story," she said. "It means asking me what I need." The simplicity of that hit David like a lesson he'd somehow missed for years. "What do you need?" he asked, and he meant it. Maya thought for a moment. "I need you to talk to me before you make decisions about us. And I need you to understand that Noah comes first, not your reputation." David nodded, the answer easy. Noah always comes first. That's non-negotiable. Maya's gaze softened. "Good," she said. And then she took his hand, fingers wrapping around his like she was grounding him back into the present. "Then we're okay." A few hours later, David drove to pick up Noah, the city still dotted with leftover confetti and tired smiles. On the way, David rehearsed what he would say, trying to find words that were honest without being overwhelming. He wouldn't tell Noah he had a fiancé like it was a surprise gift. Kids didn't need surprises like that. They needed stability. He'd introduce Maya properly, gently, in a way that honored Noah's pace. The plan felt sound until he arrived at Mrs. Hanif's apartment, and Noah came running out wearing mismatched socks and a grin, shouting, "Dad, did you see the booms?" Captain Fox was tucked under his arm like a trophy. He scooped him up, kissed his cheek, and laughed. "I saw the booms. Did Captain Fox survive?" Noah held up the plush fox solemnly. "He was brave," Noah declared. Then, as if remembering something important, Noah leaned in and whispered, "Did you tell Miss Maya Happy New Year?" David paused, heart tightening. "I did," he said carefully. Noah's eyes lit up. "Did she say it back?" David nodded. "She did," he replied. Noah beamed like the world made sense again. In the car, Noah chattered about fireworks and pancakes and how Captain Fox wanted a new cape, and David listened with one ear while the other tracked the weight of what came next. When they reached David's building, David carried Noah inside and set him down. "Buddy," David began, kneeling so they were eye level, "I want to tell you something about last night." Noah looked up, serious now. "Okay," he said, the way kids say it when they're preparing for grown-up news. David chose his words carefully. "You know Miss Maya from your center," David said. Noah vited nervously. "She makes the breathing game." He inhaled dramatically and then exhaled with a loud whoosh. David smiled despite himself. "Yeah," he said. "Well, I had dinner with her last night." Noah's eyes widened, not shocked, more like delighted. "Was it a date?" he asked, blunt as only a child could be. David's cheeks warmed. "It was," he admitted. Noah smiled in a way that looked far too knowing for 6. "Did you do the kiss thing?" David sputtered. "Noah," he said, half laughing, half dying. Noah shrugged. "It's New Year's," he said, like David was the one being weird. David rubbed his forehead, then decided the only way through was honesty with boundaries. "We like each other," David said, "and we're going to take it slow. That means we're going to be careful and make sure you feel comfortable." Noah stared at him for a second, then asked the question David didn't expect. "Is she going to leave?" Noah's voice was small, and David's heart clenched so hard he felt it physically. He pulled Noah into a hug immediately, holding him close. "I don't know the future," David said softly, because he wouldn't lie. "But I do know this. I won't bring someone close to you unless I trust them.
and I trust Maya to be kind and honest." Noah was quiet, absorbing it, and he leaned back and said, "Okay," as if deciding something. "Can she come for pancakes?" David laughed, relief sharp and sudden. "Maybe," he said, "if you let her choose the syrup." Noah frowned. "Only if it's the good syrup," and David kissed his forehead. Later that afternoon, Maya came by briefly, not sweeping in like a new family member, but stepping in like a guest, respectful of space. She knelt to Noah's level, smiled, and said, "Happy New Year, Noah." Noah studied her for a long moment, then held out Captain Fox like a formal introduction. "This is Captain Fox," he announced. "He says you can be on our team, but you have to like pancakes." Maya's eyes shone as she nodded solemnly. "I love pancakes," she said. David watched the exchange and felt something steady settle inside him. Not certainty, but hope. And hope, he realized, wasn't a distraction from responsibility. It was part of what made responsibility worth carrying. The year had begun with chaos, with headlines and fear and the old instinct to retreat. But as Noah laughed and Maya smiled, and David stood in the middle of it, he understood the real test of the whirlwind wasn't the proposal. It was this, choosing to keep showing up even when the world got loud, and letting love be something built, not just something declared.
Spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in a city that never truly slept. But in David's life, the change felt sharper than the weather, like the world had shifted a few degrees and suddenly everything he'd been holding rigidly had room to breathe. By the time 3 months passed, the penthouse that once looked like a polished showroom started to look like an actual home. Not because David bought new furniture or hired someone to warm it up, but because life kept leaving evidence behind. Noah's drawings appeared in the fridge first, held up by a magnet shaped like a tiny rocket ship. Then came a line of mismatched shoes by the door, because Noah insisted Captain Fox needed his own travel boots, even though the plush fox had no feet. Then came Maya's presence in subtle layers, a paperback on the coffee table with a folded corner marking her place, a mug in the cabinet that wasn't part of David's matching set, a small plant near the window because she said the apartment needed something alive that didn't beep. None of it felt like an invasion. It felt like belonging, slow and careful, exactly how Maya had promised it would be. They didn't rush a wedding, and David was grateful for that in ways he hadn't expected. The ring on Maya's finger was a quiet symbol rather than an announcement, and they treated their engagement like a commitment to build, not a deadline to perform. David learned quickly that real love wasn't fireworks and speeches. It was Maya texting him, "Are you eating today?" when she knew he'd been buried in meetings. It was David leaving the office early on a random Tuesday because Noah had a school presentation about dinosaurs and threatened to fire David if he missed it. It was Maya asking before making plans, always making sure Noah's comfort came first, and never once acting like she was competing with his son for attention. Noah, for his part, had his own timeline and his own tests. He didn't reject Maya, but he didn't immediately attach either. Instead, he observed her like a tiny investigator, watching whether she kept her promises in small things. Did she show up when she said she would? Did she remember he hated raisins and oatmeal? Did she laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny? Did she ever get impatient when he asked the same question 3 times? Maya passed those tests not by trying too hard, but by being consistent. She never pushed Noah to call her anything other than Maya. She never corrected him when he talked about his mom with a mix of love and confusion. When Noah got quiet sometimes, the way kids do when feelings get too big, Maya didn't pry. She offered him a coloring book or a breathing game or simply sat nearby like a steady lighthouse. David noticed something else too. Noah started sleeping better on nights when Maya was around, not because she replaced anything, but because the home felt calmer, less like a fortress, and more like a place where feelings were allowed. David had spent years thinking strength meant never wobbling. Maya showed him strength could also mean saying, "Today was hard," and letting someone care. That didn't come easily for him. In fact, he failed at it more than once. There were nights he came home tense from work, jaw tight, mind still in battle mode, and Maya would ask a simple question like, "Are you okay?" And he'd snap, "I'm fine," because fine was the word he used to keep people out. Instead of matching his sharpness, Maya would pause and say, "I'm not asking to corner you, I'm asking to stand beside you." And something about that sentence always softened him, because it wasn't a demand, it was an offer. Over time, David learned to take the offer. Work didn't magically get easier just because his heart felt fuller. If anything, the pressure grew. The engagement had become a quiet topic in the company. the way personal news always did in high-stakes environments. Some people treated it like entertainment. Others treated it like weakness, as if love made a man less capable. David discovered the difference between colleagues who respected him and colleagues who only respected his image. One board member, an older man who treated family like a marketing line, joked about David needing to keep his focus. And David surprised himself by responding calmly, "My focus is exactly why my company is stable. I don't abandon what matters." It was the first time he defended his personal life without feeling ashamed of it. And when he came home that night, Maya listened as he told her about it, not cheering like it was a victory, but touching his hand and saying, "I'm proud of you for choosing your real life." David realized that was what he'd been doing all along, choosing his real life, one decision at a time. Then came the day that quietly changed everything, the kind that doesn't look dramatic from the outside but rewires your inner world. Noah had a meltdown at school, the kind of big emotional storm that adults often mislabel as bad behavior because it's easier than admitting a child is hurting. David got the call in the middle of a meeting. Normally he would have tried to delegate, to send the nanny, to keep control. Instead, he stood up, said, "I have to go," and walked out. He arrived at the school to find Noah in the counselor's office, face red, arms crossed tight, Captain Fox clutched like a shield. When Noah saw David, his expression crumpled, and the anger dissolved into tears. "Everyone has a mom," Noah blurted, "and they asked where mine is, and I didn't know what to say." David's throat tightened so hard he could barely breathe. He crouched, pulled Noah into his arms, and held him while Noah cried the kind of cry that comes from holding something in too long. Maya arrived 15 minutes later, not because David called her in panic, but because she'd told him once, "If Noah is hurting and you want me there, I'll come." She stepped into the office carefully, didn't speak over David, and simply said, "Hi, Noah," in the same gentle tone she always used. Noah looked up at her, eyes wet, and said, "Do you have a mom?" Maya sat on the floor so they were level. "I do, and I've missed her sometimes too, even when she's right there, because people can be complicated." Noah sniffed, confused. Maya continued softly, "It's okay to feel sad about what you don't have, and it's okay to feel mad. None of that makes you bad." David watched Noah's shoulders loosen a little, as if someone had finally given him permission to feel without being fixed. On the drive home, Noah was quiet. Then he surprised them both by saying, "Can we get pancakes?" David almost laughed at the timing, but he understood the request. Pancakes meant normal. Pancakes meant comfort. Pancakes meant a reset. "Yes," David said, "we can get pancakes." Noah nodded, then looked at Maya and asked, "Can you come too?" Maya glanced at David, not assuming, waiting for his cue. David nodded. "Please," he said. It wasn't just about pancakes, it was about letting Maya be part of the messy moments, not only the easy ones. By the time the next New Year's Eve rolled around, they were different people than the ones who had stood under fireworks a year ago. David still worked hard, but he no longer wore exhaustion as a badge. Maya still gave her heart generously, but she no longer accepted half love. Noah was still Noah, bright and stubborn and funny, but his eyes held more calm, the kind that comes from stability built over time. That night, they didn't go to a crowded restaurant. They stayed home, made pancakes for dinner like a silly tradition Noah had demanded, and watched fireworks from the balcony with hot chocolate in their hands. Noah wore a paper crown he'd made himself and insisted Captain Fox needed one too. As midnight approached, Noah climbed onto a chair between David and Maya, holding both their hands with the seriousness of a tiny officiant. "Okay," Noah said, "this is the part where we do the New Year thing." David smiled. "The kiss thing?" he teased. Noah rolled his eyes dramatically. "Yes," he said, "but first I have a speech." Maya covered her mouth, trying not to laugh. Noah cleared his throat and announced, "This year I want our team to be happy and not scared. And also, I want a backyard. And also, I think Maya should stay." The words hit David like a quiet punch of emotion. He looked at Maya, whose eyes were shining, and then looked back at Noah. "That's a good speech," David said, voice rough. "I agree with all of it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small key. Not a dramatic gesture, just a simple piece of metal on a chain. "What's that?" Noah asked, eyes widening. David crouched to Noah's level, the same way he always did for important things. "It's a key to our new house," David said softly. "A real one, with a backyard." Noah's mouth fell open. Maya's breath caught. "And I didn't do it for show," David added now, looking at Maya.
I did it because I want a life we grow into, not just a moment we celebrate. Maya stepped closer, hand on David's cheek the way she'd touched him on the overlook, grounding him. That's the best New Year's gift, she whispered. Then the countdown on TV began, and when it hit 0, David kissed Maya, then kissed Noah's forehead, and Noah squealed, "We did it!" as fireworks lit the sky. David stood there holding the people he loved, feeling the clean, startling truth of it. The biggest twist wasn't that he found love at a blind date. The biggest twist was that he finally stopped treating love like a distraction from responsibility and started treating it like the reason responsibility mattered at all.
Subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for more emotional romance twists like this. Like, comment your favorite moment, and share with a friend. New stories daily, so hit the bell and stay with us.